Number 4 in Africa, plucky little Botswana, whose great deeds were mentioned in one of the greatest horror films of all time, Ernest Scared Stupid. Today, we'll bring truth to the myth of this mighty nation. Botswana sits on that southern African plateau, flanked on three sides by highlands: the Highveld southwards, the Comas Highlands west, and the Zimbabwe Highlands east. Most of the country is flat, so flat, in fact, that the Okavango River's flow becomes so gentle and slow that it slithers outwards in a big fan, forming an inland delta. Southwest of the delta lay the Makati pans, several big empty beds of salt. Most of Botswana's rivers actually dry up for most of the year, due to her subtropical, semi-arid to arid climate. Dry, but highly seasonal. Winter is the dry season, April to October, and temperatures can be fairly cool, especially during the frosty nights. Summers, however, are hot, soothed by the rain. For when the rains come, those dry riverbeds come alive, and the delta and pans bloom in a green lushness, creating Botswana's two great natural gems. This attracts thousands of beasts and birds for a spectacular safari. Botswana is dominated by the Kalahari Desert, divided in two regions. The northern half are dry woodlands, the southern even drier open savanna. North, around the Okavango, the country resembles the more classic African savanna, while the lowveld extends into the eastern corner of Botswana. Despite the claims of one Ernest P. Worrell, there are, in fact, many trees in Botswana. So, for the past two videos, we just glossed over the indigenous Khoisan, but for Botswana, we'll spend a little more time with them. After all, the Kalahari is where they were exiled after the coming of the Bantu. Khoisan is a term used for a very distinct genetic and geographical lineage of man, concentrated in southern Africa. Exactly how far north they ranged in the before times is unknown, probably south of the Congo rainforest and the drylands of modern Tanzania. For the couple 100,000 years people lived in this region, populations would have been low and fluctuated with evolving environmental conditions. The Khoisan have been separated from other humans for so long, they certainly began to diversify into their own genetic lineages, and we'll mention a couple in East Africa when the time comes. But the ones we've been concerned with in southern Africa, southwest of the Great Lakes, appear to comprise a singular lineage. The Earth is ever-changing, and in spans of geologic time, climates and biomes shift and transform as new plants and animals evolve and go extinct. The ice ages will be fun to talk about when we reach Eurasia. They affected Africa as well. In wetter periods, rivers fed the Kalahari Basin, filling it with the vast Lake Makati. Some studies suggest this is where modern humans first arose, though this is disputed. In either case, this lush country would have been quite a paradise for the Khoisan people. Some 10,000 years ago, when the climate warmed, the dry season proved too severe, and the lake began shrinking, leaving behind the Okavango and Makati pans. Presumably, one day, many thousands of years into the future, the lake will return. Here, in this desiccated world, the native San had to adapt and learn the ways of the desert. San is the term for the hunter-gatherers here, contrasting the pastoralist Kwekwe. But the San are not a single group. In the over 100,000 years they had been minding their own business, the San Bushmen probably diverged into many different cultures. Linguists have organized their living languages into three families, the sole survivors of what were undoubtedly many more across southern Africa. The age of these families is difficult to determine. Records aren't exactly common. But here's my personal speculation. Thousands of years ago, Africa experienced a period of increased rainfall, especially in the Sahara. Its end and the drying of Africa around 5,000 years ago is super important for other cultures, but in southern Africa, the Kalahari Desert expanded. San would have likely avoided the deep desert and clung to the fringes. Here, two groups emerged: the Tu people of the south and the Ka people of the north. The third group may have come from the savannas north and northeast of the Kalahari. Somehow, either from encroaching Bantu or maybe Cushitic speakers from Ethiopia, these Bushmen required cattle around 2,000 years ago. This culture spread across southern Africa, but their reign, of course, didn't last long, and they were conquered, assimilated, or pushed out by the Bantu into the Kalahari around the Delta and Pans, in turn edging out the indigenous Ka. Maybe due to the lack of good grazed land and water, many of this third group, the Kwe, abandoned cattle raising to return to the old ways. A group of the Kwe, confusingly referred to as the Kwe, continued their journey and settled the better grazed land in the Namibian woodlands and the Fynbos. These three groups shifted around a bit, the Kwe most widespread, but curiously, this makes the San paraphyletic, i.e. the Kwe Bushmen are more closely related to the Kwe cattlemen than the Tu and Ka San. These languages are known for their click consonants, lots of them. Learning these languages is really only something you can truly do as a child. The vast majority of Botswana, the Kalahari, remained Bushmanland, while the Bantu set up in the veldt and northern savannas of the country. The Okavango Bantu became the Kavango people, those of the middle Zambezi, the Tonga. But in Botswana, these regions are so sparsely populated, we'll cover them in neighboring countries. North of the Limpopo River, the Bantu developed into the Shona people, and we already know the veldt Bantu evolved into the Sutu. The Shona kingdom of Mapungubwe arose in the 10th century, collapsing around 1220, perhaps due to drought. The center of Shona power moved further east to Zimbabwe, which we'll talk about in the episode about Zimbabwe. The Shona left behind in the Bushveld emerged as the Kalanga people, and they formed their own kingdom of Butwa under the Torwa dynasty around 1450. Meanwhile, a group of Sutu expanded into the southern Kalahari under the leadership of a legendary chieftain, Kabo II, perhaps under pressure from rival clans, around the 16th century. They settled along the more permanent waterways of the Limpopo River, raising cattle. They became known by a Sutu phrase, Babatswang, meaning something like those who break apart, perhaps referring to the fact their clans like to go their own way. Their name eventually was shortened to Tswana, and like the Basutu, one Motswana, many Batswana. Another group of the Tswana, either earlier arrivals driven into the desert or more exiles from the Tswana, settled in the drier lands of the Molopo Valley. They were called Bakalahadi, those of the land of thirst. A little grim, if you ask me. The two are very similar, and some authorities treat them as both Tswana, but will be generous and consider the Kalahadi separately. They did give the Kalahari its name, after all. Anyway, we're edging into territories that have longer histories than South Africa and friends. The Kalanga Butwa kingdom was technically proto-historical, because it didn't write about itself, but contemporaries did. In this case, the Portuguese, who arrived in the 16th century. Butwa was connected to the Shona Mutapa kingdom to the east, and further to the Swahili and Arab traders of East Africa. That'll be fun to talk about, but in Botswana, Butwa continued until in 1660 when it was conquered by a Mutapa prince named Dombo, earning the title Changamire. He founded the Rosvi dynasty, a kingdom of powerful warriors that expanded across the Zimbabwe highlands and fought off the Portuguese. The Rosvi declined in the 18th century due to drought and shifting economic realities, but the crippling blow came from the Mfecane. Shaka Zulu never campaigned as far north as Botswana, but the peoples he displaced affected the lands beyond the Limpopo. A group of Sutu, related to the northern Pedi, settled in the land between the Limpopo and Shase rivers, and became the Birwa. Rosvi endured attacks from displaced Nguni, and even the Swazi sacked their capital and killed their king. Rosvi survived, but likely many Shona chiefs broke away. Mzilikazi was a disgraced general of Shaka, founding his own Matabele people. After his defeat by Transvaal Boers in 1838, Mzilikazi relocated across the Limpopo and conquered the core of Rosvi, but could not defeat Changamire Tolwachipi, who regrouped in the Shona lands of the east. Now, Matabele earned its name through a convoluted process. Mzilikazi took his Nguni Zulu clan into the veldt and mingled with Sutu and fellow Nguni Indebele. Here, he probably adopted Indibele as a new designation for his people, and after conflict with the Boers, led many of these Indibele into Rosvi lands. The British, when they later arrived, learned of Mzilikazi from Basutu and Tswana informants, who referred to the now northern Indibele as Matebele. Modern day, they call themselves Indibele, northern Indibele, to avoid confusion with the southern Indibele in South Africa. I'll stick with Matebele because it's a little easier. But what does this have to do with Botswana? Well, all this turmoil began affecting the Tswana. After so long at being on the backwater of civilization, both European and African, Boers, Griqua, and Matebele alike began poking into the Kalahari. Of course, in 1852, the British recognized the South African Republic, the Transvaal, and the Boers began formally claiming Tswana land. After inconclusive wars, the Boers and Tswana agreed to a boundary in 1860, with the Free Tswana finally pushed out of the belt. 1866, Mzilikazi finally defeated Changamire Towachipi, conquering the remainder of Rosvi. Surrounded by increasingly powerful states, several Tswana clans banded together into a confederacy, establishing control over the ivory trade in southern Africa, buying guns and horses with their incomes. They then conquered the San and Kalahari, becoming supreme in the Kalahari around 1880. About the time the scramble for Africa was beginning, Germany claimed the Namib Desert in 1884, and both Tswana and British authorities were becoming apprehensive. The Tswana were useful middlemen between British South Africa and the riches of Central Africa. Therefore, in 1885, the British government formally declared a protectorate, which they called Bechuanaland, apparently from an archaic rendering of Botswana. The original boundary encompassed the lands between the 20th and 32nd degrees east longitude and south of the 22nd degree south latitude to the borders with the Boers and British. Bechuanaland was divided in two at the Molopo River, with the north becoming the protectorate itself under local chiefs, while the south became a formal colony. Gold and diamond rushes had caused the area to become very important, and the British likely wanted to keep their eye on it. The boundaries of this protectorate excluded the Okavango and Makarikari, but also awarded Matebele lands to Bechuanaland. Cecil Rhodes was a British mining magnate who made his fortune in the diamond rush of the 1870s and 80s, and as an ardent British patriot and imperialist, saw Central Africa as a gateway for future wealth and glory for the empire. He founded the British South Africa Company, which was given a royal charter in 1889. The BSAC became most important for the future Rhodesia, and in 1891 established a protectorate over the Matebele, and white settlers began entering Matebele land for the promise of gold. In 1890, as the British and Germans began bumping elbows in Africa, a treaty was signed that set the border. From the 22nd degree south latitude, the border continued running north along the 21st degree east longitude to the 18th degree south latitude, thence east to the Chobe River, down to the Zambezi. A curious feature of this agreement gave Germany a 20-mile corridor from their colony to the Zambezi River, the Caprivi Strip. The eastern border with Matebeleland was kept ambiguous for a while. The frontiers of Bechuanaland were nice straight lines, but the land was so sparsely populated that the British, and the Tswana for that matter, probably didn't care who got caught on one side or the other. In 1893, a dispute led to the First Matebele War, but against British rifles, cannons, and machine guns, the Matebele lost. The BASC annexed Matebeleland. It also looked like the company would expand further into Bechuanaland, but some Tswana chiefs actually went to London and convinced Queen Victoria to help. The BSAC was hemmed in east of the Chasse River, and Bechuanaland was awarded the Tati concession. However, the Tswana were unable to prevent the annexation of the Bechuanaland colony by the Cape, and a little nubbin of land south of the Nosob. It seemed to have been too strategically important. The Germans were up to some shenanigans in their colony of Zuidwest-Afrika, committing genocide against the local Bantu people, the Herero. Chief Samuel Maharero led 1,000 of his people to safety along the Okavango Delta in 1904. There they swore fealty to the Tswana, eking out a living as cattle ranchers in the poor grazeland. Like the other protectorates of the High Commission for Southern Africa, a resident commissioner was placed in charge of mediating relations between the Tswana and the British Crown. The Tswana assisted the British in the Second Boer War, but after the 1910 creation of South Africa, land-hungry Boers began looking to Bechuanaland. In 1911, the Tati concession was formally assigned to Bechuanaland, the border fixed along where the Chasse River meets the Limpopo, up to a small half-circle of rocky land set aside as additional protection for the Tswana, back to the Chasse until the Ramoquebana River until its source, and from there, apparently the border goes along a road colonial authorities built all the way to the Zambezi. The BSAC territories south of the Zambezi had become southern Rhodesia by now, and when the whites there declined to join South Africa, the British decided it was best to keep Bechuanaland separate too, as the Rhodesians had interests there and the Afrikaners were becoming restless. The Tswana appreciated the British for preventing the proto-apartheid regime from reaching their protectorate, but Britain largely ignored the isolated desert country. The 1948 victory of the National Party in South Africa off-put the British government and put the final kibosh on plans to annex Bechuanaland to the Union, maybe as a separate province. Kaiserreich calls it Stellaland. As such, Britain needed to figure out what to do with the High Commission territories. Britain, however, found itself dependent on South Africa for uranium. This was the Cold War, after all. Cheap black labor made the uranium extraction more cost-effective. By now, the chief of the Ngwato clan had achieved a status of first among equals for the Tswana, and in a very interesting story, the young chief of the Ngwato, Seretse Khama, had married a white woman. This proved unpopular both to the white South African government and even many Tswana, but Britain's rash decision to appease South Africa and exile the newlyweds was met with protests and riots in Bechuanaland. Independence movements began in earnest. Various clans or tribes began organizing their own councils, building a native form of representative government. Political parties emerged, and in 1961, Bechuanaland had its own legislative council of tribes. Britain was now all aboard the decolonization train. Colonies were expensive and out of fashion, but wanted to prepare Bechuanaland and ensure a stable transition, and ironically, they preferred Seretse Khama as leader of the new nation. Two visions for an independent Bechuanaland emerged: a federal system to preserve autonomy for the tribes, and a unitary state the Britain felt would make for a stronger position. The Unitarians and Khama won out, and in 1965 built a capital, Gaborone, in a nice central location amongst the Tswana tribes, despite being in the southeast corner of the country. Khama naturally won the election held the same year. In 1966, Bechuanaland became independent as the Republic of Botswana, meaning land of the Tswana. Beginning as one of the poorest countries in the world, the capable leadership of Khama prioritized infrastructure and democracy. Discovery of diamonds attracted De Beers, but the favorable deal Botswana negotiated enabled the government to fund itself with the diamond revenues. And, crucially, unlike many other post-independence African countries, Botswana displayed a willingness to utilize the expertise and skills of whites who had settled during the colonial era, rather than expel them. I never found anything about if Botswana expressed interest in annexing the South African Bantustan Bophuthatswana or the Namibian Bantustan Tswanaland, though honestly, some Tswana leaders probably felt like such a proposition was fraught with problems. Nor did I find evidence of revanchist sentiments for the South African Tswana. 2.5 times more Tswana live in South Africa than in Botswana. A greater Botswana is a cool idea, but that's a lot of people to integrate into your country, especially as they've had much different political and economic experiences than those in Botswana. Khama and his successors built a stable government and civil service and a fairly strong democratic tradition, despite the fact their Botswana Democratic Party has remained in power since independence, coming up on 60 years. Such leadership has seen Botswana become one of the wealthiest countries in Africa, with one of the highest standards of living and lowest corruption. They are also taking steps to improve conservation of the Kalahari and other natural environments. However, Botswana still does struggle with poverty, and especially with HIV, third highest rates after Lesotho and Eswatini. I don't know what it is with the former High Commission territories. The majority of Botswana's people are ethnic Tswana, and the country is definitely set up as a state for the Tswana. As such, minorities often fall through the cracks of the system. The San Bushmen, especially, are pressured for their land and water, and often find themselves as cheap labor. But overall, I think Botswana's future looks bright, a refreshing change of pace from what we've seen elsewhere in southern Africa so far. They don't even have to peg their currency, the pula, to the rand. Next time, we're going to round out the orbit of South Africa with Namibia. I can't wait. Thank you for watching.